Just talk about the background to it. I've been in the insurance field a little while now, and really that, certainly over the last, I suppose, 5 years, seen a lot of change in this area, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I came from the background of the accrued persons regime, which sort of slowly seemed to develop over the years. And then in 2016, we had the senior insurance managers regime come into play. And that really did start to bring the foundation together, trying to align us with the banking industry and also bringing into Solvency II. So that itself was a big change. And now then, I think last year we had the consultation paper come out, and then we've had the new regulations come into effect from July, but I think they actually take effect in December. So really things have been changing really quite fast. I'm sure for a lot of your companies you've already made a number of plans and been getting things ready, but I think the timing of this presentation today is extremely useful, just so that for those who aren't aware, get yourselves up to speed, and for those of you who are aware, maybe just sort of second checking that you're doing all the right things and bringing it all to play. So we're very lucky to have 3 members of DLA with us this morning. Melanie James, partner from DLA, we're all well known from the insurance industry. Michael McKee, who specialises on the financial services side, and really this is his area of expertise. And Paul Brown, who's going to be concentrating on the HR aspects. Thank you. I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Simon. So good morning, everyone. It sounds really loud. So the objectives of this morning's presentation is to sort of bring you up to speed on the certification regime, give you a little bit of clarity around the differences between the current regime and the regime which will be going into force. An explanation as to who, who should actually be certified and who would be covered, and then a little bit of a summary on the sort of qualifications and additional sort of things that you should be looking at. Before we sort of head into this side of things in more detail, that's just us. Oh, there we go. Sorry, half of them in your slides. There we go. Thought it'd be interesting just to cover off a little bit of the regulatory environment and what's kind of led to this new regime and the sort of application of it from the banking side to the insurance side. So as you're all very, very aware, following the financial crisis, there was a significant focus on financial and prudential regulation. Financial stability really was at the sort of forefront of all governments' minds around the globe. Since that time, there's been a focus on more consumer and conduct-related sort of regulation, really knowing that market confidence and consumer confidence is something that the industry needed to build upon, and that's financial services across the board, obviously not just insurers. So we saw a heavier sort of focus towards more consumer and conduct regulation. We saw the G20 introduce their sort of 10 principles for consumer protection. We saw IMD being reviewed, and now the introduction of IDD, which I'm sure you're all up to speed on and ready to go on the 1st of October. We saw PRIPS and we've seen GDPR. So this is just another step towards that consumer protection. So the government's view of this is that this will allow or provide consumers with comfort that those at the top really will be held accountable for any wrongdoing, something that possibly regulators failed to do or failed to achieve during the financial crisis to the extent that consumers would have wanted them to. So the objectives of the SMCR, you can split the SMCR really into 3 key areas, and that would be the certification regime, which I've mentioned, senior managers regime, and then the conduct rules, which are going to be extended significantly. So many more employees are going to be impacted by those rules going forward. The actual objective is, again, to build market confidence. It's to ensure that there is a responsibility for actions from the top right the way down to the bottom, so the majority of employees will be caught. And the accountability, personal accountability for your actions, that's the key sort of point to note, and really something that the regulators will be focusing on. So before we sort of hand over to Michael, who will go into the detail and the nitty-gritty around what you need to be thinking about, what you need to be looking at, or what you've already done, hopefully. Just a few sort of key points for consideration in terms of the differences. So as I mentioned, there's the certification regime, there's new senior management functions, there's new responsibilities that need to be allocated, there's disciplinary reporting obligations to the regulators, there's qualification requirements. The differences really are quite significant, and it's not really one of these cases where you can say it's a tick box exercise, if these people are doing that. This is really the regulators saying, no, you must take responsibility for your actions, and we will be looking at what you are doing very, very closely. I guess the final point to make is that there seems to have been a little bit of confusion in the market around the application of the regime to runoff players, which is great. Everyone thinks runoff, the smaller runoff, which are 25 million sort of technical reserves or less, they won't be subject to this regime, or a much more streamlined regime. Actually, the runoff players that they're talking about are those which do not have the ability to buy new books of business. So if you've got a company which is purely in runoff and you're not looking to buy new business, then there is a much more streamlined regime that will apply to you. Of course, if you've got a runoff company and you're looking to buy books of business and sort of run it like we all do, or we all know you do, that's a different matter. You'd be subject to the wider regime. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to the expert. He's going to take you through the nasty stuff. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mel. Let's try this out first. Okay. So I'm going to move to this slide first. Mel's obviously given you some of the background already, but I think there are one or two additional points that might be worth just touching on before we move into the substance of the SMCR. So I think in particular, in terms of how this is developed, the core initial set of recommendations are found in the report of the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, and essentially their focus was obviously on banking. They were extremely critical of the approved persons regime, which of course applied right across the board from the old FSA regime, and as a consequence of that, but because that commission was only focused on banking, that's why they created, or why the SMCR was created, and initially applied only to credit institutions, so banks, building societies, etc., plus the biggest investment banks, who of course are investment firms under the regulated regime. So from that point of view, you guys in the insurance industry, nothing to worry about at that stage. But of course that created a problem. The PRA and the FCA had to create that regime because of the political pressure flowing from those recommendations of the Banking Commission. And they were never comfortable with the fact that this would essentially create two different regimes within the UK for approval of individuals. And their first step, as mentioned by Mel, was that when Solvency II had to come in, some of the requirements that were within that directive meant that it made sense to create the SIMR, which essentially was for senior managers, followed a similar approach to the, as it were, the SM part of SMCR, in other words, the senior managers, but not with the certification regime. And so that's how the SIMR came. It was a mixture of the EU obligations flowing under Solvency II, together with that fact that the SMCR for banks was already in place, and an attempt, and a sensible attempt by the regulators to then have consistency so far as practicable between the SMCR for banks on the one hand, and for senior managers in the insurance industry. Now, but of course that SIMR only applied to Solvency II firms, so if you're an insurance company, you're not in that position, you were not bound by those rules, you were still under the approved persons regime. That, of course, came in 2016. So the current position and what we're leading up to is that the regulator is essentially moving from a position where you have two regimes to a position where, for the vast majority of the whole regulated community, you will have one, which will be the SMCR. So although you, as the insurers, or shall we say the first step in that expansion, then further out into 2019-20, it's going to be extended out pretty well to the whole regulated community, except that just as there will be a light touch regime for smaller insurers, similarly there will be a light touch regime for smaller other regulated firms. For yourselves, the key date is 10th of December 2018. That's the point in particular at which the conduct rules will apply right across the board to anybody who has to come within the regime that the conduct rules captures. And we'll go on to the detail of that a little bit more now. So we have the three, within any one firm, you've essentially got 4 categories of staff in the future. You're going to have at the top people who have to be senior managers, and those people still have to be approved in advance by the FCA or the PRA or both to undertake that role. So in that sense, that's very, very similar to the current SIMR requirements. There isn't a huge change for that, although in some cases you may perhaps have additional SMRs, or perhaps in some cases fewer SMRs compared to the approved persons regime. And so that's what you might call the tip of the iceberg. Then below that becomes individuals who need to be certified. Well, what does certification require in that context? Basically, it's the people that are identified to be certified are people who typically are deemed to be material risk takers or managing material risk takers, or people who are carrying out a significant harm function and they're managers. So, for example, in a traditional insurance company, you're going to have the underwriting function. At the top of that underwriting function, the manager who is managing that will typically be have to be approved as a senior manager, because that's a pretty core function to any insurance company. I recognise in a run-off situation it may be less relevant, but I think it's quite a good example in the insurance context of the sort of people who might have to be senior managers who are not, say, the chief investment officer or chief underwriting, things like that, or chief executive, I should say. So that's material risk takers and significant harm function. And the key point about that certification regime is it's the firm itself, the insurance company itself, who certifies those individuals. And actually, therefore, in implementing the senior managers regime, typically you're going to have a bigger job in implementing the certification process than you would have for identifying and handling the aspects of the senior managers part of the regime. And that's why there's quite a significant component as well of interaction between particularly compliance and HR functions in relation to certification, for example, because appraisal, assessment, etc. is obviously very typically a core HR responsibility. Obviously, it's carried out by managers themselves in terms of the front end of the business, but HR functions obviously closely involved in it. Whereas in this case, in addition to traditional HR appraisal system, you've got to add to it essentially what is a regulatory dimension, an assessment of their fit and properness for regulatory purposes, which means that's not something that HR can run on their own. They typically will need input from the compliance and the risk side of the business. Those are the two most significant bits of the regime. But in addition, for most other staff, but not all other staff, the conduct rules will apply. And the way the regime works is basically the conduct rules will apply to all other staff except those staff who are so-called ancillary staff. Now, by ancillary staff, they typically mean people who will not be doing something that is likely to impact in any way on what you might call the regulated aspects of the business. So let's suppose you're a receptionist or you're working in a post room or something like that. Those aspects of the business are not particularly likely to affect the quality of the firm's performance in a regulated context. So those will be outside of the scheme. They're the fourth tier, which isn't actually shown on the screen. The pyramid here is those people who fall within the regime. And as Mel said, this represents a substantial extension of the FCA's focus on individuals, but it outsources essentially to you, the firm, responsibility for all but the tip of the iceberg, because it will be you, both from an HR compliance and risk perspective, who have to manage any misconduct by individuals below the senior manager regime level. But you'll be under an obligation, if you find such misconduct, to then report it to the FCA. So I think we've mostly covered this next slide in the things I've just said. So what I'm going to do is actually move on to the next slide. Who will the SMCR apply to? Now, from this point of view, what I'm saying here is not the individuals, but which firms does it apply to, and within the insurance industry. So, as I mentioned before, the SIMR applied to Solvency II firms, but the SMCR, in addition to applying to them, will also apply to all other insurers, so-called non-directed firms, and I'm sure you're familiar with that phraseology, but we'll call them NDFs going forward. Which means that most of you, as Mel indicated, will be in what I'll call the core regime, the main regime, unless you can fall within the 25 million assets and below threshold, in the way that Mel described, in which case you're subject to lesser obligations, but still actually the regime does apply. It just applies in a less onerous fashion too. So what are these new functions that will replace existing SIMR type functions? And I've set them out here. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but most of them will already be broadly familiar and can map across from the approved persons regime in the SIMR. So, executive director, compliance oversight, CEO, money laundering reporting officer, those sorts of roles. And also, in a board context, there was originally a proposal that by the PRA and the FCA that it would apply to all board members fully. But now, if you're a non-executive director who is not fulfilling the role of, say, chairing the nomination committee or chairing the with profits committee, you will not need to be approved as an SMF, but you will be bound by the conduct rules. So from that point of view, at board level, in SMF terms, what you're really concerned about is all the executive directors. Typically, the chairman of the board will also have to be an SMF, and the chairs of these committees. When you've identified that a particular individual is going to be a senior manager, you need to prepare a statement of responsibilities for that individual. Now, in some senses, this is a little bit like a job description, but not a job description as you would know it from an HR perspective, because the focus here is their responsibilities from the perspective of the regulator. what the regulator's interested in is what are they responsible for from a regulatory perspective, so that we can, frankly, take action against them if we think they've overstepped the mark or failed in their responsibilities. And it's quite important when drawing up these statement of responsibilities, both for the individuals themselves and for the firm, to get it right. And individuals in particular actually are the ones who probably need to be most thoughtful about what they're signing up for if they're going to be an SMF, because they will have a responsibility to make sure that the whole of whatever the responsibility is properly covered. The other thing that firms have to do, and this links to the statements of responsibility, is have an overall management responsibilities map. So this will basically be a chart just showing all the key SMF roles and how they fit together. And the idea would be that that map essentially covers everything with no gaps, but also typically with no overlaps. What the PRA and the FCR are uncomfortable with typically is joint responsibilities or overlapping responsibilities. It doesn't mean you cannot have them, but it does mean you have to think quite carefully about them, and you will often, if you are having joint responsibilities, have to articulate clearly to the regulator why that's the case and how that will work. Before we go on, I'd like to ask you a question actually, well, two questions. Show of hands please. First, anybody in the room who is expecting to be a senior manager under the new regime? Okay, so there are a number of you present. And what about certification? Anybody in the room who's expecting that they will be subject to the certification regime? Okay, so there are a number of people sort of directly affected by this. And in fact, actually, I guess that most of the rest of you will be subject to the conduct rules, or are likely to be as well.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Does this obviously applies in the UK, but does it also extend to Europe? Because obviously Europe follows a lot of Solvency II type reporting, so...
No, well, here's the way it works. It applies to the UK, and it will also apply to people who may need to be deemed to be senior managers of that UK regulated entity if they are outside of the UK. So to that extent, it might, in some organisations, apply to individuals who might be located in Europe. But it is not, the SMCR itself is not primarily an EU-driven regime, it is a UK-specific regime. So to take an example, come Brexit, assuming that happens, as and when it happens, the FCA and the PRA will not have to change these rules as a consequence of Brexit. They will remain in position and ongoing. So to take an example, I don't know, suppose you had a subsidiary in Germany. It would not apply to that subsidiary because that would be regulated under German law, and it would be the German regulator who would be imposing any expectations. And typically, you do not have a identical regime in Germany, although obviously the obligations that relate to senior managers that flow from Solvency II would apply. Yeah. So you wouldn't have, for example, any obligation to have a certification regime.
All right, thank you.
So if we move on then, let's look a little bit more at the certification regime. This will be applying to all insurers for the first time. So this is, if you're a Solvency II firm, this is the first time you've had to certificate staff. The individuals who are certificated will be described as performing a certification function, and they typically, basically, they will be employees of the firm. So you don't normally need to have to consider individuals outside of your own institution. The obligations that you'll have as a firm to certify your staff are to undertake an annual assessment to certify as to their fitness and properness for the role that they're undertaking. And there are various record keeping and notification requirements. I won't go into the detail of those. Now, listed below is a number of the functions that need to be certificated. The key point here is you only certificate functions that you actually have, and you'll see some of these functions really are pretty irrelevant for insurance companies. So you're not likely, I would have thought, most of you to have prop traders, or for example, algorithmic traders. But the key thing is, if you have the function and you have individuals that you have assessed as being within that function and being material risk takers or the like, then you have to certify them. Now, moving on to the conduct rules. The conduct rules, I think, should actually be very familiar to you all, because they're very, very similar to the existing principles for individuals that you find in IRLA within the FCA handbook. There's not very much difference between them, and that's not a mistake, as it were, because whenever the PRA and the FCA originally were creating the SMCR, they didn't. I mean, I think the reality is, and I've talked to some senior people in the FCA about this, they didn't really necessarily feel that the approved persons regime was as broken as the Banking Commission thought, and to be honest, I agree with them in many respects in relation to that. You know, the basic principles that were applying to individuals were the right sorts of principles. The issue is more that they recognise that as a result of the Banking Commission recommendations, they were clearly going to have to extend how that regime worked, hence the creation of the certification regime. So the rules are familiar, or should be familiar to you, and the first tier of rules, these first 5 rules that are on the slide, those are the ones that will apply to everybody. They apply to the senior managers, the certified individuals, and any other staff who are subject to the conduct rules. But given for you as insurers that you are having to implement this regime for the first time, most of your staff may be less familiar with these rules, and even if you have essentially been applying those standards to your staff, I think it makes sense that you should be running a training program explaining to staff that these rules now apply to them, and the implementation of the SMCR. Now, those rules will apply from 10th of December this year, so it makes sense to start a training program or begin developing and thinking about a training program now if you haven't already been doing that. Whether that's, of course, training like this, as it were, or whether this is in terms of face-to-face, or whether that's just by some sort of technology that they can do a training online, is obviously up to you. I know the latter tends to be the most popular now, because of course you can easily then keep a record of who's done it and who hasn't. And you have to, of course, capture not just new joiners, but existing staff, because the key point is from the 10th of December, all will be captured. And it's up to you, in a way, whether the relatively small numbers of remaining staff who are not subject to the regime, whether you include them or don't, because sometimes it just can be too much of a chore to differentiate between the two. The main thing is the ones that are obliged to abide by it are trained and aware that of the implications of breaching those rules. Moving on now to the senior managers' conduct rules. Again, they're slightly different actually from the APA rules, and the key element of these rules is that for each of, well, firstly, each of the first 3, the standard the senior manager is held to is that they have taken reasonable steps. So reasonable steps to ensure that the business of the firm for which they're responsible is controlled effectively. That's the first one. Then reasonable steps to ensure that the business of the firm for which they're responsible comply with the relevant requirements and standards of the regulatory system. So you can't, as it were, outsource that to compliance. You can work with compliance, you can, to some degree, delegate some aspects of it to compliance, but it's your responsibility to ensure that it happens, not the head of compliance or a particular individual with compliance who works with your team. Thirdly, you must take reasonable steps to ensure that any delegation of your responsibilities is to an appropriate person, and that you'll receive the discharge of the delegated responsibility effectively. So I think those, together with the obligation to disclose things to the FCA, are the key responsibilities. And I think that final one is quite important as well, because like recently enforcement action was taken against 2 individuals where there was one individual who had essentially breached FCA rules, but the other individual was part of essentially an investigation into what had happened and didn't properly disclose what had been done at the time to the FCA. It then, of course, came out later as a result of other actions what had happened, and that this initial breach had occurred, and the enforcement action was taken not just against the guy who had undertaken the inappropriate conduct, but also against the person, I think it was a compliance head, who should have disclosed that to the FCA. And I've got a quote here from Mark Stewart, who's of course FCA Director of Enforcement, on this, because there's a lot of concern, as you can imagine, among senior managers about, well, what are the real implications of this? How can you prove reasonable steps? So Mark Stewart basically says a senior manager is not liable just because the firm has breached a requirement. The senior manager's liability arises because he or she has failed to take reasonable steps to prevent the firm from being in breach, and the firm is in breach. So to that extent, if you are a senior manager, you shouldn't be, as it were, in complete fear and terror simply because you suddenly find out somebody's breached a rule. But notwithstanding that, it is difficult to evidence that you've behaved reasonably and appropriately. And so we'll look at that in a bit more detail in this next slide. So what does constitute reasonable steps? The thing here is that there isn't actually a definitive answer to that, and it's all going to depend on the individual circumstances if a breach has occurred and been notified. So what I'm going to focus here on is what are the sorts of things you can do to better protect yourself if you're a senior manager. And of course, if you're, say, within the compliance or risk department, you can work with senior managers to assist them in this. Or indeed, other departments can, other parts of the business can help you too. So certainly if you're coming into a new senior manager's role, particularly if you're either moving up to lead an area that you weren't previously leading, or coming in new, it makes a lot of sense to undertake an initial review to understand the areas of responsibility that you have and any risks, and to essentially have some sort of written document that shows you've done that. You also, because it's an ongoing obligation, need to think about what sort of management information is being provided to you, and whether that is the right sort of management information or whether you need to upgrade or improve it. The third thing is, it depends obviously on what line of business you're in, but the FCA is of course, and the PRA, very interested in whether there are financial incentives or indeed any other incentives that might skew behaviours within particular lines of business or within the institution as a whole. So you do need to think about that if your role means that you, as it were, are setting the tone on incentives, or you're part of an executive where you're part of the collective decision making on that. Do you need to write everything down? I don't think you need to write everything down, but I would say probably compared to the past, you probably need to think harder about having more documentation just to show how you've been running your line of business. And in that context, I mean, you'll all have been in a position where over the last few years there have been more and more internal committees created to evidence things like risk compliance, etc. You probably have those in place already. So to that extent, you don't necessarily need to change anything. The key thing is that there are proper minuting of those sorts of committees and their reviews and what's being escalated to them and what decisions are being made. If you've got fairly good systems and processes in place to capture that, those types of pieces of evidence are likely to be very helpful to protect you as senior managers when a particular breach occurs. The other element that is important to be able to show or evidence or describe is that when issues arise or potential issues, that you are proactive then in handling those and in resolving them. And the final element is ensuring appropriate escalation procedures and showing that you're using them properly, whether that's up to chief executive or executive board or up to the board itself. And there is more material about this from the potential perspective of FCA PRA enforcement. In the FCA handbook in particular, you've got DEP 6.29E, and that lists out considerations the FCA will take into account when deciding whether an SMF took reasonable steps. You know, these include fairly obvious things. To be frank, it's you know, it's some help, but it's not a real help in detail. But you know, what was the particular role and responsibility? And obviously, they'll be looking at the statement of responsibilities in that regard. The nature, scale, and complexity of the business, because they'll obviously have higher expectations if it's a more complex business. Plus your actual knowledge, what was it? But there is an element there of, you can't just say, I didn't know about it, if it would have been reasonable that you should have known about it, and the problem, the reason you didn't know about it was because you didn't have adequate processes in place. The other thing that is probably worth mentioning here, although it's not actually in any of the SMCR consultations, is a more recent consultation or policy statement, should I say, by the FCA. And this is about industry codes of conduct. Now, what they're proposing there is a process for essentially approving or accepting that particular industry codes of conduct are relevant codes for consideration in the context of regulated business. And in that context, in PS 1818, the FCA acknowledges that the mere fact that they recognise industry codes of conduct doesn't necessarily make them binding, or that a breach of the code would necessarily amount to a reason for enforcement action against a particular individual or a particular firm. But in many cases, evidence of complying with a code will be one way of demonstrating that you've complied with the conduct rules. So to that extent, you know, there may be relevant industry guidelines, like for example the Chartered Institute's Code of Insurance Institute's Code of Ethics, that would be relevant here, although obviously that's quite at a high level as well. But I think it's a little bit more detailed than, for example, the principles, the conduct rules. So just be aware that if it's relevant to your particular area of business or the particular breach that occurs, an industry code may also have relevance. And the fact that it's a code that isn't necessarily binding in the sense that there's enforcement action in relation to it doesn't mean you shouldn't take it into account. Okay, moving towards the end of what I'm saying, and so that I can give some time for Paul. Final thing is senior managers who are currently approved for the role, their role as an approved person, will not need to reapply for approval if their role maps across to an SMF role. So provided you map directly across, the good news is there will not need to be a further application for approval, but it's down to the firm to be clear that there is a clear mapping across. And usually what you would do is obviously be dealing with your supervisor or indicating the FCA or the PRA how you're planning, you know, who are your individuals who are going to be senior managers. So I think you probably need to indicate who you think map across and who you think you need approval for, and decide that thing as well. All certified persons have to be identified by 10th of December, so you don't necessarily need to have reviewed their fitness and properness at this stage, but you do need to be clear about who your certified individuals are going to be. And those individuals need to meet conduct rules from that date, so you need to let them know that they're going to be certified and subject to the rules, as well as, of course, the other staff who will be subject to it. But the PRA and the FCA have both confirmed that there's a 12-month window up to December 2019 in which you can do the fitness and proprietary assessments and issue the certificates for certification purposes. So there's a lot you've got to do by 10th of December this year, but there's more that you will have to do during the following year. I think that's probably the point at which I should pass over to Paul. Paul, maybe if you could take over now.
So, I'm just going to briefly talk you through some of the HR implications that you'll need to be thinking about over the coming months, and also, as Michael said, over the coming year once the regime comes into place. These things impact the whole of the employee life cycle, because, as we talked about, the certification regime and the conduct rules are going to apply to a large proportion of employees, and the emphasis is going to be on the employer to certify that people are fit and proper. So looking at processes, many of which you have in place already. You know, when the banks went through this, it was a very intense experience, and a lot of learnings that came out of it. But I'm not here to say everything that you've got, you need to basically throw the baby out with the bathwater. You will have all of these things here. It's just looking at it slightly different angle from the perspective of challenge from the FCA, but also challenge from senior managers, because they will be in a position where they're next to essentially more on the line than they were previously, and they will want to know what is in place. So who are these people that we're employing? Are they fit and proper? What processes are in place? Because if they are challenged, they need to be able to show that they took reasonable steps, as Michael mentioned. So just going through the life cycle, recruitment, clearly that's the first step. Somebody coming into the organisation, you need to make sure that they are up to the job, that you have got robust selection processes. Clearly they need to be qualified, but thinking about other fit and proper issues of integrity and honesty and reputation, financial soundness, credit checks, possibly criminal record checks. So making sure that all of those things are in place for everyone. If it's challenged, you've got some degree of audit trail on minutes. You can go back and you say, right, these are all the boxes that were ticked when someone joined the organisation. Offers of employment, contracts of employment will need to be reviewed. Just make sure that there is, employers are required to comply with the new conduct rules and other relevant regulations. For offers made to senior managers, you probably want to make them ensure that they are conditional upon approval by the regulators. Otherwise, you may have offered a job to someone that they can't actually carry out. Michael mentioned a clear job description, clear that fits in with the statement of responsibility. Job description, slightly different. I mean, we'll not go into the same detail about the regulatory requirements, but really important to have a clear job description, because that feeds into the assessment of someone being fit and proper and being certified. Because if you've got a clear understanding of what somebody's meant to be doing, then it's much easier to apply objective criteria to determine, is this person doing the job, have they done it appropriately, and are they fit and proper going forward? Because there is that aspect of looking not just at the last year, which is often the case when it comes to performance reviews, like, is this person able to do the job? Yes, but actually when you look at fit and proper, you need to be thinking about whether or not this person can do the job going forward. So the certification regime brings into focus how you certify people on an annual basis, how you appraise them, and also performance reviews. Because up to now, normally you'll have a line manager who will know what this person is meant to be doing, and whether or not they will be the best person to assess whether or not they're actually doing the job properly. But what we've seen, particularly with the banks, is a need not just for line managers, but also for HR, legal and compliance to be looking at this issue of certification, because it's not just about performance, it's all about these other criteria, as I mentioned before, ensuring that they are fit and proper people to do that job. I think there's also the importance of having that interface across the organisation is ensuring consistency. Because if you've got just a line manager, they may be making a decision about fitness and propriety, which is different from someone else in a different department. So there needs to be more oversight and ensuring that there's consistency in a way that probably wasn't required, and in some organisations won't be there to the same degree. Think about it from a senior manager's perspective. They, in our experience, are going to want to have more insight, more oversight rather, than they've had to date. The greater responsibility, more accountability. So the sort of things that we have seen senior managers looking for, increased pay, possibly. But in these circumstances, it's applying to all firms, and it's going to be rolled out to all FCA regulated firms by the end of next year. So it's not the competitive advantage of saying, well, I can move somewhere else. But and for many people, this is just codifying what their existing responsibilities are anyway. We have seen some examples of people who are becoming senior managers, where they weren't previously in a regulated type role, possibly someone in IT or maybe HR, who may, for them, there's greater accountability and therefore more risk, and that may be somewhere where they say, well, I'd be paid a bit better for this, please. Access to employee information, Michael mentioned, just wanting to know what is happening in the population that you are responsible for. So they may want to know about disciplinaries and grievances, what is going on there, sickness records. Are there any obvious issues that you can see by looking at data that they probably didn't have previously? Access to the regulator. I mean, one of the senior manager conduct rules is a requirement for senior managers to disclose appropriately information to the FCA. The information that the FCA would reasonably expect to receive. Some people have said, well, this is essentially a whistleblower's charter. A senior manager almost incentivized to run off to the regulator just to make sure that they are doing what they are required to do. Clearly, there's a slight tension there between the obligations of the senior manager, maybe what the firm as a whole would want, and so there may just need to be a need to refresh your whistleblowing policy, look at that, see if there's an escalation process that needs to be put in place so that these things are being dealt with appropriately, and reported by the firm rather than having lots of senior managers running off and reporting things. Directors on offers and insurance, directors' indemnities, the sort of things when you're identifying senior managers and before you talk to them, worth looking at to see what sort of cover you have just in case those questions are asked by senior managers. You know, am I covered? And if so, to what extent? I'm just going to touch on disciplinary grievances. It's an area that, well, particularly disciplinary action, is something that has caused the banks a lot of issues when it comes to fitness and propriety. Particularly if the disciplinary issue is something that could be a breach of the conduct rules, which could result in a requirement to report or notify the regulator, but it also has impacts for the individual, because if they are found to have breached the conduct rules, then for those that are subject to the regulatory reference regime, that will go on their reference. Regulated firms were required to provide references that are fair and accurate, and looking back on the previous 6 years to see whether or not there has been any disciplinary action. So that's why just looking at your disciplinary policies and ensuring that they are robust and that any decisions are made, again, the same way as for appraisals and certification, but done in a robust, rigorous way, but also that there's consistency across the piece, so that within the firm we're not having one disciplinary manager who's making, either deciding that somebody should be dismissed or some other disciplinary sanction, which is a breach of the conduct rule, whereas a different decision may be made elsewhere in the organisation. So more of a role for compliance and legal rather than just being an HR issue. There was so Megan Butler, who I think is the Director of Supervision of the FCA, was interviewed, I think, in a select committee earlier in the year. She made an interesting point just generally about conduct, and it was in the context of the Me Too campaign and sexual harassment. And her very clear statement within the financial services sector as a whole was that conduct, if it's relating to something like sexual harassment, could fall within the senior manager's regime, because looking at fitness and propriety, you're looking at reputation, you're looking at honesty and integrity. So disciplinary decisions about what may seem to be personal conduct could also impact on the conduct rules, and therefore the decision that someone makes in this context could have more serious implications for someone's career than would have been the case otherwise, which then exposes the company to potentially significant claims, because if an individual's then not able to get another job within the financial services sector because it's on their reference, then there are more significant implications than was the case previously. So I think those are the key things that I just wanted to touch upon. We'll address all of those. Action points, where it's just looking at ensuring that you've got your policies reviewed, your employment contracts up to date, job descriptions up to date, and just having processes that, if they're ever scrutinised, you can go back with your senior manager and say, look, I knew what was going on. I took reasonable steps. There were these processes. There is an audit trail, so that as a senior manager you can justify what you did, and also as a firm you can be confident in the people that you're employing, and that you're also meeting your obligations to ensure that they are fit and proper and have been in the previous year and will be going forward. And I think finally, just to mention training that Michael mentioned, the conduct rules as they're coming in, that there is a specific requirement to train people on that, and as Michael said, a lot of firms are using online software, but there's a specific requirement for training to be tailored to individuals' roles. So just having one training program that is very generic it is unlikely to meet the requirements of the regulator. It needs to be, you know, specific and ideally with some degree of examples or role play based scenarios so that people understand conduct rules and how it's relevant to them. So I think that's the end of our formal presentation. If anyone has any questions, we'd be very happy to take them.
Any questions?
I have one. So you're talking about implications of all of this. Do you have any examples of the types of enforcement action that would be taken?
Well, there's a variety of different types of enforcement action that we do. I mean, broadly speaking, there would be the same types of enforcement action that have already been taken against individuals under the approved persons regime. The key differences here are twofold, it seems to me. One is that the conduct rules apply much more broadly. So consequently, there would have been a number of situations in the past where the PRA or the FCA could take action against, say, the firm and maybe one or two individuals who were approved persons. There might have been other individuals who were involved in the activity who they would have liked to have taken action against but couldn't because they weren't approved. Whereas now, because of the conduct rules, they will be able to take action against those individuals. That's point one. The other point is really, I suppose, in relation to senior managers and this reasonable steps requirement. I mean, that I think does change the game a little bit for senior managers. To a degree, you already had that approach in some of the cases where senior managers were acted against by the FCA, FCA in particular rather than PRA. There was a good example of that was, unfortunately off the top of my head I've forgotten his name, but I think it was the head of UBS on the wealth management side, who they did take action against because of problems within the area he was responsible for. He fought that all the way up to the tribunal, and although they had the FCA had fined him, he successfully defended that at tribunal level on the basis that he said he'd done what was reasonable in the circumstances, and he was able to evidence, for example, that he had carried it. He basically come in when the event had already happened towards the end of the process, and so he was able to show that he'd taken proactive steps to deal with the problems, and the tribunal in any way agreed with him. So that actually is the best enforcement example, although it precedes even the introduction of the SMCR for banks, as to how a senior manager may be able to defend themselves under a reasonable steps approach. But we haven't really had very much recent activity that gives you a lot of evidence. I mean, one of the interesting ones, of course, is the whistleblowing enforcement action against the Chief Executive of Barclays. Because now that, of course, was focused on whistleblowing, but essentially would also have been undertaken in the context of the SMCR applying to him, and clearly, you know, they found against him that he had inappropriately interfered, as it were, with the whistleblowing process in a Barclays case. I mean, my feeling is that he didn't do that, shall we say, deliberately breaching the law, but through a mixture of not being familiar with the UK processes as perhaps he should have been. He clearly did act inappropriately.
Can I ask about outsourcing of activities?
Yes.
Particularly with firms who would be regulated themselves.
Yes.
So if there is an activity being undertaken, maybe not the senior at the top level, but at the lower level, and something occurs, the insurance, the main insurance firm, what would their position be in relation to that activity happening in the outsourcing? It's still their responsibility to the extent that it affects them, or can they be wider if it's something that...
Yeah, what's the extent to which they can wash their hands of
Yeah,
it, and the extent to which they may have liability? I think the answer there is it links into how the outsourcing rules work. So the primary obligation on the outsourcing rules remains with the firm to ensure that it is a suitable and appropriate outsourcing, and that's both at the point at which you, as it were, undertake the appointment and consider who's appropriate to do it. But of course, it's an ongoing obligation as well. So in many ways, it operates a little bit like what we've just been discussing for senior managers, namely that I think if there's a particular individual, for example, who is deemed to be the person responsible for that outsourcing, then the key issue will be, did they take all reasonable steps to make sure it was an appropriate outsourcing, particularly if the firm that they outsourced it to is regulated. If there's been mismanagement, misbehaviour, you would expect that focus would be more on that firm itself and the individuals within that firm. But the firm who has outsourced does still have a potential risk. I mean, as with all these cases, it depends for precise fact. And similarly, the manager responsible, because typically it'll be a manager for the outsourcing, also has to be thoughtful about the risks for them as an individual. So but what it doesn't do is fundamentally change what you would do in an outsourcing. It's still the outsourcing rules that you would focus on what they say about how you should behave, and the overlay on that for the individual conducting the outsourcing was, am I taking all reasonable steps to ensure this is operating well?
And the other question I want to ask was, so in terms of who it affects, those the firms you explained clearly about Solvency II and those not covered, and it might be a temporary situation, but those operating in Europe under the freedom of services, so
yes.
They're not in the UK, but they've written business, does it affect them at all?
It currently does affect staff in the UK, but only to a limited degree. It's a less intensive regime. But if of course it's a subsidiary and then therefore UK authorised, it's a different matter. I mean, I suppose that might be the one area where, in a Brexit context, because the rules in relation to branching in and such like have changed, there might be some difference of impact for them. I don't think fundamentally that will change how the SMCR will apply them. And but typically, it's usually a much less extensive focus. So the senior management level, usually, unless it's a very substantial branch, it's just typically the more senior executive, the branch manager and that sort of it, who would be called by the senior managers regime. Although so I think that from off the top of my head, I think that's the position.
Okay. We are running a little bit late. Any more questions? Right, okay, well, can we thank our panelists? Excellent. I'll just make an admin point to say, if you haven't got the app, get the app. And there's a couple of things on there coming up. Those lucky enough who will maybe go to Monte Carlo, there is a briefing there on Monday, if you haven't spotted it. But there is also, there's some claims training on mesothelioma immunotherapy, which obviously through the EL space is really something that is really hot at the moment. And that's on September the 18th. And there's also networking drinks in the evening of Hall's Brothers, that's the 18th of September. And the other one I really want to point out is the AGM on the 19th of October. So that should be good. We normally have the regulators there. Get a chance to hear what their current views are. So if you'd like to put that in your diaries.